Welcome! In this episode we will scrutinize the various traditions that from the dawn of recorded history till today tells of the relentless search for eternal life and perpetual youth. Why is it that this path of human endeavors has lasted relatively undiminished for so long? Is this quest what lays behind all the strife for their ultimate power? In all known historical times, that is, history recorded in texts and images, we humans have searched for a cure against aging, and people have relentlessly tried to create a potion or find a liquid to regain their lost libido and physical health, as it was in their juvenescence and early young adulthood. The names for these remedies against getting old and dying of the diseases common to affect old people are many, and some spans over thousands of years and are found all over the world. Names such as ambrosia, the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life are still quite familiar terms today, but the ancient Indian name Amrita and the modern, expanded version of the term Ajarasya are mostly esoteric to the general public. The fact that we humans have self-awareness as individuals makes us capable to see and understand that we will inevitably die. The cultural anthropologist Professor Ernest Becker said that we fight this insight of our mortality fiercely, though, by constructing and maintaining culture. Culture helps us to get a sense of security and certainty in an uncertain and insecure world, placing us in time and space, and gives us meaning and feeling of purpose. Tens of millions of people will die every year, and we are trying our best to prevent accidents and diseases. But one thing we as humans don't even consider, generally speaking, is to try to prevent death from aging, which is by far the most common death. Death of old age is considered unreflectingly to be a natural law, though closer studies shows that death by old age is just the accumulation of degenerative diseases like cancer, osteoporosis and Parkinson's, for which modern medical science is trying to find the cure. So, have we gotten any closer to that old dream of defeating death and even to regain our youth, or for that matter stay strong and healthy indefinitely, just as we are when we enter our young adulthood? Let's look into the history of this vast but, generally speaking, ignored or forgotten part of human activity, since the ancients wrote it down about 4,000 years ago in the Epic of Gilgamesh in the old Mesopotamia. Firstly, we shall review the many traditions or myths regarding this immensely popular current in our Western culture. There are different themes in play here. The fountain of youth, the elixir of life, fruits that will restore youth, gold powder for longevity, ambrosia and amrita, which both are names for the nectar of life, and many more. But let's start from the beginning with a man called Gilgamesh. About 2100 BC, the much older Sumerian poems about Bilgamesh were collected and written down in the Akkadian language in cuneiform on clay tablets, and thus became the famed Epic of Gilgamesh. For millennia this text was in the school curriculum in the Middle East and had a huge influence on culture all around. Those who learned to read and write got the story about a man, Gilgamesh, in search for eternal life in a juvenile state. They copied the narrative about this hero who got the greatest of secrets. The legendary king Utnapishtim says to Gilgamesh, quote, "Let me reveal a secret, let me initiate you to the god's secret knowledge," unquote. Then the king goes on describing a plant of a sort and says that if Gilgamesh eats it, he will be young again. The plant was to be found on the bottom of the sea Apsu, which in Sumerian and Akkadian texts is the primordial sea of life and of all wisdom and knowledge. The Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary states about this sea, and I quote, "A mythical place where all the forces that affects life has its origin," unquote. Then the story tells of how Gilgamesh dove down into that sea and collected the plant, just to have it stolen by a snake. It seems that Gilgamesh did get immortality by eating the plant, but some experts argue that it was the dive into the sea of all power and knowledge that was giving him the eternal life, not the plant itself. Now, this whole text is of course subject to dissimilar interpretations, and recent translations differ quite a bit from earlier ones. But the fact that Gilgamesh is on a quest for eternal life and youth is unanimously accepted. Macrobia was a land in Africa somewhere beyond today's Libya, and described by the Greek historian Herodotus, who lived in the 5th century BC. The people of this land lived, according to their king, to 120 years or even longer. This by bathing in a special spring and by eating boiled flesh and drinking milk. The water in the spring was, as Herodotus had it told to him, very weak, and that nothing could float on it, and it gave a sleek skin. In the hymn Rig Veda, in the ancient text called Veda or Knowledge, dating from 1700 BC, Amrita is described as a drink that gives immortality for the gods. They, the gods, start to lose their immortality, whereby, in short, they churn the ocean and 14 treasures emerges, of which Amrita is one. This myth is closely related to, or maybe the source for the Greek old myth of the ambrosia, or the nectar of the gods, which had the same properties. Much later on, one of the different attributed authors to the Greek Romans of Alexander from the 3rd century AD tells of how he showed something of a religious fervor in his search for the water of life. All of these, from the Gilgamesh myth to the recent ones before Alexander the Great started to conquer the whole world, would make it quite plausible that the main, yet secret quest for him to go into the unknown East and to conquer India was to attain eternal life. He was, after all, a son to a king, and he studied for Aristotle in medicine, philosophy, morals, religion, logic and art. He grew especially fond of Homer, and he got Aristotle's own annotated copy of the Iliad. Homer, notably, wrote about nectar as the drink and ambrosia as the food of the gods, and the names both means immortality. Alexander's official objective for all his military campaigns was to spread the Hellenistic cosmology and culture, and he very much succeeded. Thus, we speak today of the Hellenistic world. Then came the Roman Empire, and they did much the same, but subjugated peoples more at the other direction around the Mediterranean Sea. They continued to spread the Greek or the Hellenistic culture further in space and time, and of course that means that the ideas of a substance or liquid for acquire eternal life came up in the biblical stories of Jesus. John chapter 4 verse 14, originally written in Greek, states, quote, "The water that I shall give him shall become him a well of water springing up into eternal life," unquote. Science and reason was the way for the philosophers at the Museum and the Serapeion, which were parts of the great library at the city of Alexandria in Egypt. A vast city founded by Alexander the Great himself in around 330 BC. Here, in this center for science and learning, was by an estimation up to 400,000 scrolls or books collected from all around the known world. It had place for 5,000 students, and through its 600 years of history, they studied for many super famous teachers from Euclid to Hypatia. Its first period was quite strict Hellenistic in learning, under the eyes of the many gods of the Greeks, the East, and of course the Egyptians. But then came the parting of the Roman Empire into the Occident and the Orient, and the philosophies and the prevailing Abrahamic religions got more and more mixed with the science of the day, and the westernized alchemy as we know it today was born. The library in Alexandria, with its many buildings, was destroyed in several waves. First accidentally by Rome, then intentionally by the Christians, and lastly by the invading Muslims. The inherent notion of a substance such as ambrosia in this long period of religious frenzy was undoubtedly heresy, no matter the religious side you were on. Yet, still the quest never ceased. It went underground. Now, let's jump ahead and into medieval alchemy and the science of early modernity. The most used name for these different substances was lapis philosophorum, which got its anglicized name, the Philosopher's Stone, as late as in the 20th century. The alchemical term chrysiopeia meant the transmutation of base metals into gold, also called purification, and was the goal for the practical side of alchemy. The Philosopher's Stone was in many manuscripts described as a luminous red powder that had 3 characteristics and could turn any metal into gold, and ingested it could also give perfect health and extended life. The philosophical side of alchemy meant mystical, spiritual enlightenment. It was all about how to make man and the world perfect, and it dealt with the purification of one's soul. This vast field is extremely complicated to study, and it seems that, in the times, no one ever got to know that deep knowledge it always alluded to. Some alchemists, it is said, became insane, lost in the truly vast maze of esoteric writing and the enormous amount of elaborated symbolic pictures. In later times, it has come to the public attention that many of the famous early scientists and royalties were obsessed alchemists. The most famous of these scientists is of course Sir Isaac Newton, who for most of his life incessantly did alchemical experiments, alongside his more famous works, which still today are so vital to science. He wrote extensively about his experimental philosophy and chemical inquiries, of which much ended up in his many treatises. But in secret, he also wrote much about his many occult speculations, of which some have survived till today. These texts implies that he actually aimed at both the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life. Another hero of the scientific breakthrough was Robert Boyle, who wrote the book The Skeptical Chymist in 1661, which marks the line between alchemy and the modern science. In 1663, Boyle was noted as one of the council members of the assembly called Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge, or simply Royal Society. In spite of this, he was an astute and industrious alchemist who, through all of his life, was, among many other things, trying to transmute base metals into gold. Despite the alchemical transmutation frenzy in the late Renaissance, continuing through the early modern period to the late Enlightenment in the 18th century, was arguably even more obsessed with the alluring powers of lapis philosophorum, especially among the nobility. This very much esoteric underground activity, which by now was spread outside Europe, did not by any significant degree lessen. In the late 19th century, the famous Swedish writer and dramatist August Strindberg, probably one of the last alchemists, experimented with transmutation and other occult ideas. Naturally, he wrote, both in his famed book Inferno and in his diary about this time, which took place in a shabby hotel room in Paris 1894-96. The many loose papers from this period has recently been compiled in the book The Occult Diary. Strindberg published a correspondence between him and the neo-alchemist and occultist Jolivet Castillon, who later claimed that he had succeeded in making gold from silver in 1920. Though the hunt for these elusive substances were permeating the undercurrents of the cultures of East and West for generations, it is not considered by historians to have had any significant impact on the driving forces of kings and rulers. Yet we know that many, if not most, kings and queens had quite an interest in the matter, and they all invested a lot of the state capital in the process. Many, as we are about to discover, had their own laboratories, and they hired famous natural philosophers and infamous alchemists. The latter often in secret for obvious reasons, the suspicion of heresy. Under the guise of secrecy, the unofficial official task for the alchemist was to make gold from base metals. But there is much supporting the idea that what they really wanted was to produce the matter that could give everlasting life, a powder of gold, the projection powder. This substance could supposedly give you a blissful life in eternal youth. The confusion between this powder and the powder called the Philosopher's Stone was that the latter could transform lead into gold. But sometimes the Philosopher's Stone was the pictorial symbol for the philosophical transmutation and of perfection of the soul. The English Queen, Elizabeth I, kept her famous astrologer, occultist and alchemist Dr. John Dee close to the court, though he had his famous occult library and study in his home at Mortlake outside London. He was searching for the lapis philosophorum for most of his life, and this was encouraged by his queen. Some reports even implies that she herself had a laboratory for alchemical experiments. Regardless of this, she and the many alchemists of this culturally illuminated era in English history searched vigorously for both the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life. The Swedish Queen Christina, who abdicated the throne of Sweden in 1654, had powers encompassing the whole Baltic Sea. All of this is well documented and extensively written about, but her side as a practicing alchemist is not paid much attention to at all, though she had her own laboratory in Hamburg and a couple in Rome. In Hamburg, she had the local experts to help her, and in Pesaro and in Rome she conducted many elaborated experiments herself. She met with, amongst many others, the very famous alchemist Francesco Borri, who in his turn was sought after by his fellow alchemist Sir Isaac Newton, though they never met. In 1667, Christina reported in a letter of a successful transmutation where the projection powder was used. Johan Rudolf Glauber, who discovered sodium sulfate among other matters, had lively contact with Christina, and she got his recipe for balsamico mercurale, a universal medicine to cure everything, which was found in the purse she had on her when she died 1689. She also had a description for alkahest, a universal solvent invented by the alchemist Samuel Forberger. Christina wrote a lot throughout her life, covering many topics, and notably she wrote a scientific paper, or notes rather, showing her deep interest in alchemic chemistry. Now these two examples of royal interests in the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life are by no means unique. Diane De Poitiers was the renowned mistress of King Henry II of France. She drank an elixir every day made of gold chloride and diethyl ether. Modern scientists have analyzed her hair, and it contained gold 500 times above normal levels. They also found mercury, which was used as a purifier in the elixir. Rudolf II, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Burgundy among others, who was devoted to occult studies and the science of the day. Rudolf employed both Dr. John Dee, the Queen Elizabeth's astrologer, and Dee's assistant, the so-called scryer Edward Kelly, as his alchemists. This after Kelly had convinced Rudolf that he had accomplished his first transmutation. He promised then to produce gold in the emperor's court. He got a knighthood and a lot of founding, but he failed and was imprisoned. One can easily argue for the theory that these kings and queens wanted desperately to be first to gain eternal youthful life, as well as an abundance of gold. What godly superpowers would not be attributed to that sovereign crown? What a magnificent force that country would be! Has eternal youth maybe been the actual goal behind a veil of necessary power politics and unscrupulous realpolitik for the ruling class? In the way monarchs or absolute rulers was reasoning and rationalizing their actions for taking and maintaining power, trying to make this substance and using it must have been absolutely irresistible.